today. We're going to continue our work today with the board on the ideas and the priorities and the work that is happening to get ready for the start of the next school year, in response to the governor and DHHS requests that every district create a plan A, B, and C, and all of the different areas that are considerations under that plan. So we're going to continue the work that we started last week in that arena, and we've got a number of folks that are going to be working with us today and presenting. I will turn it over to Lloyd Gardner so that he can get us kicked off with who the folks are going first.
Thank you, Superintendent. Good afternoon, members of the board. Thank you for this time that you are spending with us this afternoon and for another opportunity that we can continue the discussion around reopening schools for 2020-2021. Initially, when we started this discussion, we outlined for you the multiple streams of work that we needed to make up the scope of our planning. And with those respective streams, we began to unpack the many layers tied to it in order to continue to move this forward to eventually land with a framework that would guide our operations for the new school year. When we were together last in our series of workshops, we covered a number of these streams of work, unpacking the planning considerations for you. That included looking at the state health guidelines, looking at transportation, looking at school building occupancy, as well as some elements tied to our instructional delivery models, specifically around the virtual school option. In addition, you had the opportunity to provide us input around any of those planning considerations that you too wanted us to consider, in addition to what we had already unpacked. And even just as important, you had the opportunity to participate in a protocol where you identified a number of factors tied to several categories that you wanted us to consider in the planning, whether it impacted policy, the economic welfare of our families, the economic decisions of our schools, as well as any innovative ideas that you thought we could consider as we look to this new structure and new environment in which we would be operating. Today, we will continue that discussion where we will unpack additional streams of work. As you can anticipate, and as we've said a number of times, all of these different streams of work interplay with one another. And we need to devote the attention to make sure they align and support each other. And so as we look at these various levels of support and layers of work, it's important for district leadership, our school-based personnel, our community, and you as the board to have a great understanding of how the different factors impact one another and inform and shape our end framework that we will end up developing. And so today will be equally important as the other work sessions were about understanding those different elements tied to the categories we have planned to share with you today. So in looking at our desired outcomes on this particular slide, we hope by the end of our time together, you will have a deeper understanding of our school community input, an understanding of the ways in which we're enhancing our cleaning, disinfecting, and sanitizing process, an outline of the behavioral health supports being planned for students and staff, and then updates around our human resources decision. When it comes to our input, we have tried to gain a lot of different input using many different avenues and different formats, and we continue to seek input from our school-based staff, our students and families, and our broader community. You too as a board thought it would be important for you to have the opportunity to seek input as well as we look to the reopening plans for next year. And you have been using your board advisory councils as a structure to gain that input. I want to take just a minute to thank Chief Schools Officer Jackie Ellis and the area superintendents and special assistants for their partnership and assistance and helping us facilitate those focus sessions. And I also want to thank the Chief Technology Officer Marla Gaddis and her team for helping us with the technology support. I had the opportunity to join a number of the back meetings, and I saw firsthand the incredible amount of input we were getting from parents who are in back groups, as well as community members at large who joined the back session. I hope you too found the input to be invaluable, and we will begin to look at some of that input in just a few minutes, as well as in the days to come. Thank you for your work with those sessions, and thanks to everyone who may be listening to our work session today, if indeed you did participate in those work sessions, for the time you devoted to it and the work and the input you provided. They have been most helpful, and they will be instrumental in helping us shape and inform some of our decisions in the days ahead. So looking at the back meetings, I want to pose just a question to you about what themes arose in your particular Board Advisory Council session. This is just an opportunity for us to have a touch point about the Board Advisory Council meetings you've just had and some of you continue to have this week. We'll take about a minute, no more than two, to go around the board and just for you to share your reaction and your thoughts and some of your input that you heard in your sessions by highlighting some of those major themes. I think as we continue to make connections with the input we got from the back meetings, as well as the input we're getting from other avenues, we will begin to see alignment a lot of the themes that have surfaced and how they will inform and shape our decision. So if I may, I would love to call on each board member individually. I recognize that some have not had their back meeting yet, and that's quite all right. I know that you will be having them in the day or two ahead. But for those of you who had, for about 2 minutes or less, if you could just highlight what you learned or heard from your group, that would be wonderful. And I would like to ask if I could start, Ms. Scott, with you first. Could you share themes that you heard conveyed in your session?
Thank you, Dr. Gardner. I'd be happy to share some of the feedback from our meeting. There were definitely a difference of concerns based on grade level. Not just to do with, getting an idea of what school will look like for those, but just to, even just concerns about the students themselves. So we heard a lot of, suggestions about even changing buildings, perhaps with, younger grades. Moving into larger buildings to accommodate for spacing. There seems to be a little bit more comfort with our middle and high school grades in terms of accessing remote learning, where parents of elementary students are a little uncertain with that, but trying to figure out how that would work. But there are definitely the theme of A and B days, and there's a lot of questions about that, but it does sound like many people, particularly those of younger students, are interested in returning to in some sort of brick and mortar setting, and that's from families. From staff members, who there weren't as many in our BAC, but just other meetings that I've had, we're definitely concerned about the childcare aspect for those staff members and teachers and faculty members who have their own children, if we were to do a rotating schedule. But that was really the biggest feedback. There seems to be the parents of younger children want to return to a brick and mortar setting. Parents of older children seem to be a little bit more comfortable with incorporating more remote learning.
Thank you for sharing those highlights. I appreciate it. I could turn to Ms. Cash. Ms. Cash, would you share in less than 2 minutes about some highlights you heard from your Board Advisory Council?
Yes, can you hear me?
We can hear you.
Okay, I just couldn't get my other part. I just want to say there were several, maybe 4 things that I got from the back and speaking with NCAE. And I think I've heard maybe clearly that the middle school and high school should probably be treated differently than the elementary school. And that was one input. Most everyone liked the blending of remote and classroom. Not easy, they understand, but also a consideration they all like. I think every one of our parents and our teachers understand we've got to come to a compromise in the middle, that we will not probably hit both aspects of the extreme, both in or out, and they understand that, and we'll continue to work with them. And all the other things that I've heard is just the appreciation of the fact that you guys are seeking input from everyone, and that's important. So I guess what I come away with this mainly is that middle school and high school seems to be a different animal to work with, and the elementary is certainly different on its own aspect. That would be it.
Thank you, Ms. Cash. I appreciate those comments. Chair Sutton, could you share with us some themes that you heard?
Sure. The As far as concerns, health and safety, obviously the big concern for everybody. Some sort of blend or hybrid is what most parents and teachers seem to be interested in, where there's a mix of in classroom and virtual learning. What that mix might look like is sort of across the board, from a lot of folks liking sort of the A day, B day idea to ideas such as splitting up the grading period and having 4 weeks. Half of the students come in for 4 weeks, half students come another 4 weeks, so that there's more consistency as opposed to the bouncing around from day to day. So a lot of ideas about how to blend classroom versus, not versus, classroom and virtual, but a heavy majority around the mix of both getting back into the building and mixing that with some virtual. So the big themes there, I think around the safety, obviously, hand washing stations, mask and that sort of thing. I think a huge preponderance of teachers feeling like we ought to have some sort of requirement around masks. Parents, of course, feeling a little more lenient about that, understanding that kids may or may not keep them on. But I think because our teachers would be considered our frontline employees, if you will, a heavy emphasis from teachers and those in the building, that there'll be some kind of requirement around wearing masks. So those are probably the 3 themes from ours.
Thank you, Mr. Sutton. We appreciate those comments being shared. If I could ask Dr. Martin, I believe you had yours this morning. Can you share with us some themes that might have rose in your session?
Yes, thank you. Absolutely. And yeah, our session concluded just an hour ago, so haven't had time to fully process, but a lot of great input. As others have noted, there's a clear, I will even say, consensus around that, some kinds of blended options are going to be necessary and important. A concern that came out from several teachers is concern that if there are too many options, that often puts a heavier burden on teachers. And so we need to keep that in mind. There was a lot of support around the ideas of staggered attendance. We'll come back to that in just a sec. There was an important suggestion that we may need to, not that we may need to, but we should think about some cross-school options. It's not necessarily that each school needs to have all the remote availability for just students in that class, but maybe some teachers who are less comfortable going back into the classroom could become district resources, and trying to figure out how that district work might build consistency would be useful to think about. In terms of important factors for coming back, clearly safety, sanitation, hygiene were very high. There was one suggestion, didn't get talked about, but it was in the chat, potentially forming a health and safety committee at each school, maybe patterned after the school improvement team kind of idea, just to make sure things are working and operating appropriately. Another concern that more on the academic side was a call for a focus on structure and accountability for students. Sometimes that focus gets a little bit too heavily focused around grades, but there needs to be some measures of accountability to make sure students are coming, engaging, doing their work, and of course there's accountability on the teacher side as well to make sure that work and communication is being done. In terms of what would blended learning look like, there were a lot of people who would love to see live streaming, and they'll recognize that there are privacy issues on that. Our group 2 had ideas about maybe 4 or 5 weeks on, 2 weeks off, though it might be more practical, as Mr. Sutton suggested, 4 weeks on, 4 weeks in person, 4 weeks virtual might have some sense. We had a lot of reiteration that not everybody has capacity to do the remote And many of those advocating for remote are those who have the capacity to do the work at home. So clear attention needs to be given to families who can't provide the resources, and that's beyond just whether you have the technology or not. A potentially really good idea, recognizing that any virtual or remote engagement doesn't have the initial personal connection. Somebody suggested that maybe for the first week or two of class, maybe a third of the class would come and have, sort of like the staggered entry to kindergarten, do some staggered entry at all levels so people get to know who is who, and that could facilitate remote instruction. And then a lot of concern thinking about very hands-on related classes like CTE, early college ideas, spec ed, arts, but even, right, we've designed a math curriculum that requires a lot of intensive hands-on engagement that's very difficult to do in a remote setting. So there was some even idea that what would be blended and what would be the remote, what would be the in-person might be class specific instead of day schedule specific. Finally, on communication, over and over again, consistency is key, and kind of a real key takeaway is regular as opposed to random communication will be most useful. So sorry, not more digested, but we just finished an hour ago. Thank you.
That is great. Thank you, Dr. Martin. Appreciate that that input you've shared. I will now turn to Ms. Kushner. May you share also some themes you heard in your council session.
Thank you, Dr. Gardner, and thanks to the area superintendents, tech staff, and everyone who made it possible for us to have the feedback through BACs. It was very appreciated by parents, and parents also expressed a lot of appreciation for our teachers and what they've been doing since closure. So that was gratifying to hear at the District 6 BAC. Like my colleagues have said, parents expressed concern about health and safety and about social distancing in District 6. Our school buildings are uniquely designed. They are not based on a prototype, so there was some concern from parents about specific building and so the smaller classrooms and social distancing in specific schools. And I assured them Ms. Sharp and the team were looking at it, but still there's going to be some unique challenges with some of the buildings and social distancing. Parents expressed a real desire for choices for students who maybe have underlying health problems or family members with health risks as far as COVID, and a need to be agile, to be able to make different decisions when different situations arise. There's also seemed to be support for a 2-track system, 2 weeks on, 2 weeks off, to mirror the exposure of the illness and sort of the way COVID is presenting itself, with a 2-week incubation period, so that we could rotate folks at home. And there was one idea in the chat that I wanted to lift up of what other districts are doing. I know we've talked about other districts in North Carolina having remote learning academies, and we'll hear more about that, but there was some interest in what other learning from other districts, as and there was concern that the virus is getting worse, that we're trending in the wrong direction, and so that our leadership needs to be cognizant of following the data and the science on the outbreak of COVID. And for that, I also communication. There was expression that it was both overwhelming and not enough. So as you would expect, I think Dr. Martin's idea of having consistent communication from the school might be the most efficient. So if we get in a regular rhythm of giving information to our families and our educators, I think there was concern that teacher voices were not being heard as loudly as parent voices, just by the, and so that was one other bit of feedback that we got. Thank you.
Thank you. I appreciate that. Mr. Haggerty, I believe you've had one session. I believe you may be having another. Would you like to share some of the themes that arose in the first session you facilitated?
Thank you, Dr. Gardner. Yes. Participate in our meeting. There was many that we felt need to host a second meeting, and that meeting has reached its capacity in terms of RSVPs. So there's a lot of interest out in my area about this topic. And for even the people who are unable to attend, want to be able to send emails, to participate in thought exchange, and just to continue to provide their feedback to the district. I will say that we covered a lot in the meeting. I really appreciate the work of Rich Gottlieb and Area Superintendent Cedric Williams to help moderate everything. I will say I think we had a little bit of a different discussion maybe than some of what we've heard so far. I think there were clear, but I will say very respectful differences of opinion. For example, I think we had some people that very much wanted to have their children back in school, and there were some that very much did not want their kids going back into school unless they felt safe, and whether that was a vaccine or just confidence in the safety protocols we were taking. I think there was a division there. Similar divisions on issues like masks, from the very simple, my children won't wear masks, to we think masks should be required. And then the debate, even from some teachers, about how the mask can interfere with their teaching, and wondering if there were alternatives like face shields or something else that would allow students to be able to see a face, see emotion, but still offer them some protection. The biggest theme I got out of it, I think, was that parents wanted choice. I think some of the initial support for blended learning, I'm not sure if parents got it at first. And dig out what that meant. First, some thought that meant, well, I want, we'll have blended learning where my kids go all the time and your kids get remote learning all of the time. But as we discussed it and got into more scenarios, we really got a lot of good feedback about what folks could and couldn't tolerate. I do think that there is still a large number of people in my district that do want choice and an option, whether it's a virtual academy or being able to opt in to get on a live instruction list. To close on a couple of points, there was worries from different student groups. Elementary school is about, well, what if children just go full-time back in school and use the high schools? And then high school parents saying, no, don't gore our ox. We don't want to be the ones getting all remote learning. So there's a little bit of back and forth there. Similarly, there was an expression, a lot of people, like Dr. Martin's group had mentioned, were interested in live engaged teaching, that synchronous teaching we've talked about. Teachers on the call talked about the problems we have, the barriers, I should say, with our privacy policy and things that don't let us set that up, even though there was that demand. This did bring up one concern, though, that I'd like us to be able to answer as we come out of these discussions, and that was the expectation that teachers would be able to teach live classes and remote learning that's going on at the same time. At first, they thought the teachers would have live instruction days and remote instruction days. And I think we had to clear up that the expectation is that, no, there would be kids in the class every day, just two different groups of kids. And so parents want to know a little bit more about how that would work. I think parents in some cases are reserving judgment. I think they're cautiously optimistic. They appreciate the work that we've done. They do want to see more detail, and that ultimately that will really drive a lot of their action. Some parents are looking to hold their kids out of kindergarten and they know more. They consider their options, just want to see how to answer these questions. So a lot of great feedback, and we'll see what else we get tonight. Thank you.
Thank you, Mr. Haggerty. That was very helpful. We appreciate that. Ms. Mahaffey.
Well, we had our BAC last night and we had over 230 participants. So it was really exciting to see, folks coming in and sharing. And John Enns and his team and our tech group with Allison and Marlo did a phenomenal job in helping to facilitate and help things go smoothly. And I cannot thank them enough. And to all the parents and staff members and teachers that joined us, it was a great group and a great discussion and a wide range and a lot of questions, as we all have questions. And A lot of thoughts regarding what Plan B is going to look like, and a lot of concerns about what that will look like, and knowing there isn't a very good solution for Plan B, and it's a little all over the map as to what different levels, elementary, middle, and high school, are looking for, and concerns for how it's going to work for teachers. And if my kids are out of school, am I just going to put them in a camp during the time, whether it's a half day or 2 weeks or every other day? And a lot of concerns about the implementation of Plan B. Consistency was a word that got used a lot. Making sure that we as a district and our schools are consistent in how things go through. Wanting more communication, but better streamlined communication. A lot of requests for district communication to come from one central platform, so you're not having Remind and Seesaw, or having to visit a website or someone's Twitter page, or making sure that communication, whether it's at central office level, school level, teacher level, that there's a streamline, and parents wanting to be able to have access to what their kids are able to do so that they can help. There are just a lot of concerns on how this is going to be implemented, a lot of concerns as to, working with the uncertainty. Remote learning, hearing from parents and teachers on what that platform is going to look like, because they're interested in opting in if that's going to be the case. But wanting it to be, as we've talked about, more intentional than we were expecting to go to school on Friday, and come Saturday, school is closed and we're flipping a switch. So making sure that we're intentional, that we're consistent, and that we continue to communicate in an intentional and consistent manner.
Thank you, Ms. Mahaffey. I appreciate those comments you've shared and the input you've given us. Mr. Fletcher, we'll call on you now, if you will.
Thank you, Dr. Gardner. I too share appreciation for Dr. Sexton and our tech people to support us. We had a good conversation. Health and safety paramount. That's the basis on which I believe parents will make a decision of how they will choose to engage the public school system or not. Is their confidence that their decision will provide maximum health and protection for their individual children. We also had a lot of conversation about an undefined blended learning, whether it's AB days or AB weeks. There was not much conversation about, well, what happens to families who have to work and are not at home to provide that childcare in the off weeks. A clear point was an expectation of much higher quality instruction for any remote strategy than we were able to deliver at the end of the previous academic year. That the teachers involved in remote learning and distant, whatever term we're going to use, remote, distant, online, whatever, that there are people who've been doing it for years. Their strategies for maintaining high level of engagement and student interaction, and that that needs to be built into whatever the learning strategy is for, as it is in the building, as it would be for students not in the building. In terms of health and safety, there's some who say, when we talk about follow the data, what data? It was brought up in our group that we've got this statewide data that says there's a challenge. It was brought up in our group as well that the number of children under 18 who are reported to be infected is dramatically low. So what set of data is going to guide our decision? Some parents want athletics to start immediately and don't see why it shouldn't. Others are saying, I'm going to keep my kid at home until there's a vaccine. And what they really mean is until everybody is vaccinated. which is a lot longer than after a vaccine is identified. I will say this, they're very appreciative of communication, but also as what Lindsay shared, the variety of platforms that it came on. And there was also a huge desire that there be one instructional platform. Parents were having to navigate across different platforms based on different children in different classes. And they would really like to have a single platform that they can become very comfortable with in order to monitor and assist their children.
Thank you, Mr. Fletcher. I appreciate that. Knowing that you have not had the opportunity to hear from one another as far as the input you've heard in your respective board advisory councils, we wanted to structure this time at the very beginning of our session today for you to do just that. And I hope that you found it valuable. We are finding the input that was generated in your sessions valuable as well. And that is some of it's been its final stages of being compiled and will be sent to you so that you have that so you can continue to review it. We too will review it as well as we continue to use this input as well as all the input we've gathered from through other avenues to help shape our framework and our decisions. It's interesting that the input not only addresses kind of the initial stages of the framework and how we will return to school, but it also speaks to how we will operate and function ongoing throughout the year with regard to the platform, the consistency of communication, the accountability, the grading, and the like. So it really has many aspects of it as far as twofold in helping us with our work moving forward. As I shared in our desired outcomes, it's important for us to continue to unpack for you and our community many of the planning considerations that are having to be given thought to with regard to funneling it into the final decision of the framework we have. And today we're going to be hearing from a maintenance and operation. We're also going to be hearing about our wellness of our students, as well as our human resources and staffing. Tomorrow, just to give you a little bit of a preview, because so much of your input has touched upon that, we will start shifting our attention to the health guidelines, and we will also start talking about options that we might consider for our instructional delivery models. The three areas that you're going to hear today are well connected to input that we have received across the board in all kinds of formats. And that talks about how the environment and the learning spaces will look for our students and staff once they return, how we will attend to the mental and emotional wellness of our students and teachers after having been out since March, and how all this impacts our staffing. So the themes that we've heard really impact these three areas, and I'm excited to invite different individuals to our session today to unpack some of this work for you. First, I'm going to invite James Crook, who's Director in Custodial Services, and Nate Slavic, Director of Energy and Physical Plant, to join us to talk about a number of the considerations we're having to unpack in this area. James and Nate, I'll turn it over to you at this point.
Thank you, Dr. Gardner. Let me begin by saying that all of maintenance and operations have as a goal the clean, safe, and functioning buildings. And this is not a change for us. We've been repairing, maintaining, cleaning, and disinfecting schools all along. Now, my role here today is to address the work of custodial services. Our response to COVID-19 is a refocusing on those areas, protocols, chemicals identified by the various agencies, CDC, DHHS, EPA, as those needing specific attention. The refocusing will be directed at the frequency of cleaning and disinfecting with approved chemicals and processes that will keep our school environments safe for staff and students. We can go to the next slide, please, Beth. Over the past 12 months, we have converted all schools to a new cleaning chemical that is both a cleaning compound and a disinfectant. It is an EPA-approved product for emerging pathogens, as is required for the SARS-CoV-2, which is the virus that causes COVID-19. It additionally kills some other things as well, but the COVID-19 is the issue that we're most attuned to today. Beth, next one, please. In a process that began a year ago, we have returned all schools to a full service cleaning every day after school hours. We've reviewed the processes and schedules in light of the guidance from DHHS and CDC, and we will continue to adjust as is necessary. Next one, please. Now, it is important to note that the guidelines and recommendations have been a moving target during the evolution of this virus. We have and will continue to operate on the most up-to-date information available and will adapt as new information is released. This work will be a collaborative effort between all of the groups listed here. Now, there are many questions yet to be answered on numerous topics. Custodial Services is prepared to respond however necessary. The district leadership assigns responsibility for such things as meals eaten in classrooms, increased frequency of trash removal, maintaining hand sanitizing stations, cleaning playgrounds, cleaning classrooms during the academic day, cleaning buses, etc. Additional funding will be required for labor and material for any of these added functions. And my next slide, please. We have in place a protocol for responding to an outbreak, be it localized to one room, an entire school, or multiple schools. The response team is equipped, trained, and ready to react. Timeframes will depend on the scope and size of the outbreak. And the next one, please. I think that before we get to questions that anybody might have, I want to defer to Nate Slavic, the Director of Energy and Physical Plant, for any input that he might have. Nate?
I think the other thing that we didn't touch on so far, and it's not as important, I wouldn't say not as important. It's not as high a focus as keeping our schools clean. From an energy standpoint and from an HVAC standpoint, we do plan on providing additional outside air through our mechanical systems. We do want to try and ventilate the schools as much as possible. It's just that's direction also from the CDC.
Thank you. And we're ready to take any questions that anyone might have.
Dr. Gardner, Bill Fletcher.
Yes, go ahead, Mr. Fletcher.
James, thank you for the report. You indicate additional financing. Have you figured out what that number is?
Well, sort of, kind of, maybe, but not really, if that will work for an answer.
No, it won't.
It all depends.
No, it won't.
Yeah, it all depends on what direction we're given, on what things need to be done, what is decided that the frequencies need to be increased to, if they need to be, what extra duties we'll be taking over. We have begun to throw together some preliminary numbers. I mean, for instance, getting student desk and chairs cleaned after hours every night has a pretty hefty price tag of about $20 million a year. You know, because we only have 14,000 classrooms to deal with. So yes, we're looking at all those numbers. We're going to need some direction before we can firm anything up.
Okay, I didn't see cleaning tables and chairs nightly in your list here.
No, there are way more things,
right,
that we are considering than what's there. Those were just some examples of the things we're looking at.
Okay.
We are much more in depth than what we presented here in a few minutes.
I understand. Thank you very much, and I think it's indicative of the financial challenge in everything that we're going to be considering as we make decisions on how to reopen schools. So thank you, sir.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
So, Lloyd?
Yes.
So before we get it, I've got several hands from Ms. Kushner, Ms. Scott, Dr. Martin. Before we get too deep into questions, process-wise, what are the decision points that are appropriate for the board and then that staff is making, so that we have the information that we need and can give the proper feedback, or the feedback and input that is appropriate in terms of decisions, particularly from a fiscal standpoint.
Yes, as we begin to map out which direction it appears that we may be going with the instructional delivery model, Mr. Sutton, we've been pulling together the fiscal implications of all these various items, and I would anticipate that what if we need to come to the board about any budgetary decisions around those fiscal implications, we will be visiting that with you. But the fiscal implications tied to each of these work streams is also being mapped out as we speak. James Crook's team is also working with our purchasing and Kelly Creech to map out the items that have to be purchased with regard to PPEs, as well as the cleaning products and supplies. And so that work has begun. Inventory list has started as well, and we are mapping out those fiscal implications to that. I anticipate that we will be coming back to you.
Okay. All right, Ms. Kushner, you had a question?
Yes, thank you, Chair Sutton. And I think it's wise for us to begin to quantify and put a price tag on the things, because the protocols that Mr. Slick and Mr. Crook talked about are what our community want to hear about. They want some of those details, and I appreciate that we are forming those details now, but I appreciate hearing the ideas and that the training's in place. And my question was the same as Mr. Fletcher's, as to how we are, how we will be financing the extra labor and materials that your staff needs, so we can undergo this work. And I think it's important to recognize that the cuts that we had put 10 years ago after the last recession in 2009 on custodial services, that were finally had gotten up to a back to a normal, and now we have a very new threshold that we have to reach. That's so we've been playing catch up for a very, very long time in this area, and we have to just keep focused on the needs of our faculty and our employees and our students. So thank you for the details today, and onward.
Yes, ma'am.
Mrs. Scott, thank you, Mrs. Kushner, for that. Mrs. Scott.
Thank you. Excuse me. And regarding the protocol for a suspected or presumptive or confirmed case, can you give a little bit of information about what that does look like, what that would look like? Is that information that can be provided right now?
It certainly, yes, I can. It is, as you can imagine, not a brief process. But in the bottom line or a brief synopsis is, once we get notification that there's a problem, an outbreak somewhere, and that we are instructed to move ahead with a cleaning and disinfection, I pull together my team. I've got a team of 14 supervisory staff members. Each one is responsible for about 15 schools, but we pull that team together with a few others, and we descend upon the school. We go through a refresher process. We lay out exactly how we're going to approach the school or the area that we need to deal with. We be sure that everybody's got all of the appropriate equipment, the PPE. We break up into two-person teams. We move through the building with the appropriate equipment and chemicals, and we move through disinfecting almost every square inch of a building. We've done this in a couple of buildings already. Some for practice was a good move for us to do. We worked the bugs out of this thing. Depending on the size of the school and the size of the area that needs to be disinfected will determine how long it will take. We have a process in place for monitoring the work as it is ongoing, tagging rooms as they are completed so we can double check to be sure that we don't miss any particular area. And then when we are finished, we head out, leave the building closed up, return to it at a point later, double check things to be sure that the building is put back together, and then notify leadership that they can have the building back.
Thank you for that. I know there has been, Mr. Fletcher referred to the data, and that there is certainly a variety of information that's available, but is there any consideration given to air conditioning units and heating units in terms of should there be a case, because we hear a lot of the airborne aspects of the virus? Is there any sort of cleaning that can be done with those units to help with filtration or otherwise sanitizing those?
I think that,
Yeah, Nate, will you address the filtration in that process?
I think as part of our process, as a standard, we would change our filtration. I don't, from what I know about the virus, it's airborne communication is mostly due to water droplets. There hasn't really been a lot of direction to sanitize, central station air handling unit or something to that degree. But I know that we would probably change filtration as a matter of fact, belt and suspenders kind of approach.
I will mention that CDC does not have any recommendations for, not that I've seen anyway, I'm not saying it, and I've looked pretty carefully, but I've not seen any recommendations for any particular treatment of HVAC systems.
Thank you. I appreciate that. And it certainly is challenging to be monitoring the guidelines and to be bound by those guidelines when we also see different types of information coming through that concern our families. Those were the questions I had. I appreciate all the work that you're doing.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Mr. Crook, before going to the next question, thank you, Mrs. Scott. I wanted to piggyback on a question she asked. So when you are going with the two-person teams, are you just at a high level, are you using the sprayers or how are you deploying, I guess, the chemical that you're using to sanitize? We've seen in the news different kinds of things, especially when you're cleaning large buildings, everything from the sprayers to drones or that sort of thing. So how are you going in and cleaning a large building like a school, and how long does it take on average, since you've done a couple of practice or test runs?
Sure. The last building that we did, was a middle school, sort of a medium-sized middle school. We took a team of 18 people inside, broke them up into those two-person teams, and the actual process of the disinfection took about 5 hours for those 18 people. So there's a lot of manpower involved in this. The process that we use is that we are using our product called Virex Plus, which is the one I alluded to earlier. It's the EPA approved product for emerging pathogens. At a particular concentration, it will kill anything that it lands on or lands on it after it stays wet. The thing about spraying is that, and about disinfection in general, is that surfaces have to be remain wet long enough for the chemical to do its job. So a spray and wipe is not what you want. Now, ideally, you want clean surfaces to disinfect. However, that is not necessary to remove soil and dirt because you can just spray on top of it and kill it. However, we do go in with generally backpack pump-up sprayers. There are numerous types on the market that can be used, but we have found that the standard pressurized pump-up sprayers are quite good. at allowing you to control the amount of chemical that you are spraying on surfaces, so where you can see what's going on, you can provide adequate coverage. One of the things that we know, and stop me, Mr. Sutton, if I get too technical here,
Sure.
but one of the things that I know is that the size of the droplets has a lot to do with how effective this product or these products are. Because if it's too fine of a mist, you get good coverage, but it will not stay wet long enough. So we've worked through all those things, and we go in with pump-up sprayers and wrap a school up.
I think
And if I'm
one other thing we want to add there is that the protocol calls for spaces to be closed up and unused for 24 hours before we begin our work. So I think when you're talking about disinfecting a facility or a classroom, I think we are proposing it's probably going to be out of commission for 48 hours, so that we can leave that 24 hours dwell time, which is required, and then do our work, and then ensure that our work's complete before we turn it back over for use.
And then if I'm a teacher or the principal or data manager or anything, how is there an assurance that I know my room was disinfected and not skipped? So you leave a seal or a strip on the door or something to ensure that each room, each area in a building, sort of similar to a hotel or what have you, where I've seen they've gone in and started doing these kinds of things. How am I assured if I'm coming back into that building that each room has been clean?
Well, there are a couple of things that happen. If we are looking for a way to assure each individual person that walks in, we're going to run into some troubles. But let me tell you what we do.
Maybe not each person, but again, just sort of.
Sure. We start off with a blueprint of the building, and we divide it up, and we be sure that we've got everything done. We at each of the sites, we have one central location where we've got a project manager that is monitoring everything and making assignments and checking off. Each team carries with them their section blueprint. They check off rooms as they go. As they leave a room, we've been using a little adhesive dot to put on the door frame above the door where that area has been done. It gets a little more difficult in some areas that might not have door, like bathrooms. Where exactly are we going to put the dot and how do we do it? You go into media centers. How do we know that every single thing got hit? Well, at some point, we've got to recognize that the people that we are employing to do this work are being extremely careful and professional in their performance. But to answer your question, if there's a dot above the door, we got that area. If they don't have a door, then we got to figure out how we're going to do all that. It's not like there's a toilet seat in every room that we can put one of the hotel strips over. So I'm with you though.
I got you. Yeah. Okay. No, that's helpful. I don't want to get too technical, but that's helpful. That answers my question. Mrs. Mahaffey.
Thank you, Chair Sutton. Mr. Cook and Mr. Slavic, I cannot imagine the amount of work you and your teams are facing right now. And I really want to thank you for your dedication to this and becoming overnight experts in it's early, virology as we go through. I think what you're hearing is there's a lot of interest from board members and the community in how these plans are laid out. And my question really is directed to our communications team. So Mr. Simmons, if you're here, families, we heard a lot in our BAC meetings that families are very concerned with health and safety. And I would love to see a communications team up with our Mr. Crick's team and Mr. Slavic's team to really show videos of how this is being done and what that protocol looks like, because they don't all have time to go to a board meeting. But if we can show them what we are doing in order to ensure our students' safety, our teachers' safety, I think that will mean a lot to families.
Ms. Mahaffey, I think that not just showing folks, but the way in which we explain to people what all of the details are for the various parts of the plan about what's going to be different next year. But your point about videos makes sense, as does a lot of printed material and web material, which I think is going to be launched and well used shortly at the conclusion of these discussions we're having here about putting together an entire plan for the 2021 year.
Yeah. But I mean, based on what I'm hearing, it is a big workload, and I just want to thank you both for being here and sharing your knowledge with us. Thank you.
Thank you.
I think Mrs. Mahaffey is correct that, you know, this involves us getting into a lot more detail or level of detail that we typically are not used to getting into or digging deep into. But I think for the purpose of providing our community with as much assurance as possible, there may be some need for that, and some rationale behind that, and how we communicate that will be key. So thank you for that question, Ms. Mahaffey. Mrs. Cash, see your hand raised.
I just want to say, okay, first of all, Mr. Cook, I think this is a well thought out process on how you go through a building after a possible COVID indication. So I want to thank you for that. That is not easy to do, and you've thought that out a lot. I'm very impressed with the knowledge that both Mr. Slavic and Mr. Cook have on what the CDC requirements are and how you take the reality of what really needs to be done versus what may have been heard in the public. So thank you for that. You are very knowledgeable on this. I want to appreciate that. So as a healthcare provider myself, I'm not an expert, but I've been entrenched in this for the last few days at Wake Med. But I would be very comfortable after hearing your presentations today to tell any of the staff and parents that I have conversation with that you have thought this out really well, and that I feel very comfortable in what you are doing. And I agree with Ms. Mahaffey that a video, because you should be very proud of this, a video of what you are doing would be really great for our community to have. And I think you should be proud of what you've done. I appreciate both of you.
Thank you. Certainly, we will be happy to work with communications in that process.
Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Cash. Dr. Martin.
Thank you. I too want to say very appreciative of the update you provided. I think that cleaning protocol should an outbreak take place is outstanding. Also want to really appreciate that you're going to hear that you're going to increase the outside air intake, because I think increasing the airflow will have a significant positive value. Just a quick question, and I know all of this is resource dependent, but we heard about, cleaning at the end of the school day. Could you tell us a little bit about any thoughts, plans for during the school day, between classes, going to lunch, hallways? What's the plan for during the school day? Because particularly at the middle school and high school level, at least traditionally, we don't have the same group of kids in the same classroom the whole time.
Yes, sir. There are considerable challenges, part of which is just the timing of how you gain access to areas for the amount of time that it would take to do something properly. So that's one challenge to deal with. The other is the chemicals that you use. Like I explained a little bit earlier, they need a certain dwell time to be an effective disinfectant. So that's, again, a time function. The other is the chemicals also are not the kind of things you want to leave around where students can have access to it or be affected by it returning to a classroom if the desk is still wet with this chemical. So we've got all those challenges to look at and deal with. The other piece of this is what really is effective in fighting this virus, because we know from all of the information that we can clean and disinfect like crazy, and then the next person that walks in that's infected, you know, everything that we've done is just out the window. So the real important thing in my mind to supplement or to lead everything that we do is that everybody wears a mask and everybody washes their hands, and everybody uses hand sanitizer. Those are the most valuable things that can be done. Now, I can clean it like crazy. And with enough resources, I could clean it in between every classroom. But I'm afraid we're probably not going to have that kind of resource.
Absolutely, and I appreciate that. And that's kind of the information that I wanted to make sure was out, because I think you all are doing the best you can, and we've got to get you more resources. But like you noted, you can clean like crazy, but if an infected person comes in, it all starts again. So that requires us to think about the masks, the scheduling, and whatnot. So thank you.
Dr. Martin, I would like to mention as well that the technology surrounding this disinfection process is always ongoing. And there are a couple of products and pieces of equipment that are out there that, if proven to be effective, might be just what we need to move forward with. And I don't want to spend too much time dealing with things that I don't have real answers to yet, but just know that we are not sitting back and waiting for somebody to plop new ideas on us. We're not sitting back counting on the way we've always done things to be the answer. We are constantly researching and looking for better solutions.
And I appreciate that. And as people know, I am a chemist. And kinetics is what we're talking about here. And your dwell time is absolutely right. You know, if you've got a kill time, a 50% kill time of 1 minute, you got to go 10 minutes before you get to the 99.9% kill. And so that means even if you did everything between classes, there's nothing you're going to be able to do to shorten that time. So I appreciate your continued work.
Yes, sir. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Martin. Ms. Johnson-Hosler.
Thank you, Mr. Sutton. I think you already answered one of my questions because it was actually similar to Dr. Martin's, but I guess a follow-up I have to that, and while certainly we know the science is still happening and the wait times, but Dr. Martin's question was around cleanup in between like hallways and cafeterias and such. But my question goes back to restrooms. And I'm curious, since this is newer to us and the science is new, are there things that we can glean from hospitals or home health care or rehab facilities where we know that they've learned a lot of lessons from COVID outbreaks there? So I'm just curious if there's any way that, and those are places where facilities where people live. So I'm curious, have we reached out, or do we know if there are lessons learned in ways that we can use, given that we would be using chemicals and need wait time for our students? Has anybody checked to see if there are lessons learned there that we could possibly use for our schools?
Yes. The product that we are using, the one that we switched to just about a year ago, we started the process of switching, is a hospital grade product that is used throughout the world in healthcare facilities. It is a top of the line product. It's a quaternary ammonium. Now, one of the other technologies that's out there in cleaning chemicals is an accelerated hydrogen peroxide. And I believe that Paula DeLuca is looking into some of that product for her cafeteria areas. I also have a source, and we're looking for that. One of the big problems right now is that all of these chemical companies are pushing the limits of their capabilities, and some of them have absolutely refused to entertain any new customers on particular products because they just do not have the capacity to produce. So we've got to be, the good news for us is that the product that we're using is a hospital grade product. So we'll have access to it as we move forward.
Okay, but so I guess you brought up another point, but we don't have a sense on timing. Again, this is, I mean, no surprise, anything that wasn't being used at this quantity and frequency is definitely probably going to have distribution issues. But I guess I'm also asking about, like, in terms of using the product and wait times, because I'm considering, and actually this one is far more for our younger kids who still some supports in using the restroom, may not always use the restroom in a way that would need, I believe, more frequency in cleaning. And so we've talked about the other common areas, but that's certainly one that I'm curious where, how quickly could we have, how much time would we have to wait to use that grade of product in between use time?
Well, the good news about the restroom cleaning is that in most schools, there are sufficient downtimes as students are in classes. And as our daytime custodians learn schedules and coordinate with teachers, and because there are multiple bathrooms in buildings and hallways and various classrooms, we're able to close down areas for the length of time necessary. So after we clean, coming through and hitting with a handheld spray bottle all of the major touch points and areas, 10 minutes later, we're in good shape. And there are enough bathrooms that students and staff can stand to do without the one they're used to going to for a few minutes, and off we roll from there. So I'm very comfortable that we can do the cleaning and disinfection necessary in restrooms throughout the day.
Okay, I mean, that's good. And I would definitely still circle back to the previous conversation. I haven't had my BAC yet. It's Thursday night. But a lot of the questions I've had have been like my colleagues are elementary school students. And one of the things I know that we would want to talk to teachers about is for K2, when they have such a sequence and they actually do take all their classes kind of in a rotation before lunch to the restroom and after lunch. And so they're generally 2 to 3 classes at least. That's from my own voluntary schools that are using that bathroom pretty frequently around the lunchtime period. So, and they generally don't go upstairs in their building or leave their hallway. So I guess that's just something for staff to consider having conversations with teachers around recognizing that their patterns would also have to significantly change, because you're right, there's certainly enough bathrooms in the building, but what we know is K2 uses the bathroom on their hallway, and there's generally not a lot of lag time between those classrooms circulating from restroom time for especially our K2 ages, because they have much more strict restroom time. So I think, so for the academic side of the house, just another thing to add to our list in supporting teachers around their habits in the building. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am.
Thank you, Ms. Johnson-Hostler. Mr. Crook, just one final question. Ms. Mahaffey wanted to know, and her question was along the same lines as Ms. Johnson-Hostler's in terms of our ability to procure the necessary supply for schools and making sure that we have enough source to continue cleaning, especially looking at the number of buildings that we have. So do you foresee running, and I guess you kind of touched on it, there might be some challenges around being able to keep a supply, or can you speak to that just briefly?
Yeah, very briefly. There certainly will be challenges, but we have a very capable purchasing department, and they have been working on this for months and months. The first whiff of this being a problem, and they got started working in conjunction with Kelly Creech, and I have all confidence that they're going to be able to secure for us what we need.
Okay. All right. Thank you for that. Ms. Scott, did you have another question?
I did not. I'm sorry. I'll lower my hand.
No, okay, no problem at all. Dr. Gardner, I'm going to turn it back over to you. I hope we didn't stay too long there, and please keep me straight on time.
I will, Chair Sutton. Thank you for that. Our next area to receive some attention is in our behavioral health. And we know that this is a prioritized area for our board with regard to the emotional and mental welfare of our students and staff. And I'm going to invite Paul Coe to join us now to share with the board many of the things that they are trying to put in place to support our students as they return. This work is going to be undergird all of the academic work that we do so that we know that our students are in a good place, both emotionally and with their social emotional learning, as well as their mental welfare. And Paul, I invite you to join us at this time.
Thank you, Dr. Gardner. Good afternoon, Chair Sutton, Superintendent Moore, and board members. In our presentation today, I'm going to share with you some of the work we've started and developed with we're calling our Behavioral Health Steering Committee. And so through this presentation, we wanted to share first the importance of behavioral health supports for students, families, and staff in our return to school. We also wanted to make sure to level set common language around what behavioral health is. We wanted to make sure you left with an understanding about the purpose and desired outcomes of the Behavioral Health Steering Committee, and then understand the next steps of our steering committee and understand our work in progress through examples. So first, in our transition back to school, we wanted to acknowledge that the return to school from this COVID-19 pandemic and school closure is a challenge. And as such, we want to make sure we're helping to equip our students, families, and staff with additional skills and dispositions through behavioral health centered on social emotional well-being, behavioral well-being, and mental well-being. And as we return to school, we're developing guidance that we're going to, like I said, hope to equip all of our stakeholders with toolkits that are going to support them. And as this is expansive work, we felt it was important that we outline the scope of our work with you with some of the level setting language about our work as a steering committee. So as our name states, we're doing the work of developing a systematic support structure of behavioral health for staff, family, and students in our return to school. And in this work, we're making sure that we're addressing the social emotional needs, the behavioral needs, and the mental health needs of our district. And you may have seen this definition before from previous presentations and in our back meetings around social emotional learning. Just a reminder that this is the process through which both children and adults acquire and effectively apply the knowledge, attitudes, and skills necessary to understand and manage emotions, set and achieve positive goals, feel and show empathy for others, establish and maintain positive relationships, and make responsible decisions. And then for our second facet of our steering committee around behavior, this is from work that we've done within our district. The definition for behavior that we're using is the foundation for implementing behavior support is defining and teaching and supporting appropriate student behaviors in classroom and non-classroom settings with a focus on desired behaviors. And schools hope to prevent negative behaviors as much as possible and form ways to help students who may struggle with behavior, and behaviors are specific, observable, and measurable. And for mental health, this is from the National Association of School Psychologists. We're defining this work as good mental health is critical to children's success in school and life. Research demonstrates that students who receive social, emotional, and mental health support achieve better academically. School climate, classroom behavior, on-task learning, and student sense of connectedness and well-being all improve as well. Mental health is not simply the absence of mental illness, but also encompasses social, emotional, and behavioral health and the ability to cope with life's challenges. So with that level setting language, what we've set as an intent for our behavioral health steering committee is that we want to develop a systematic support structure of behavioral health for our staff, family, and students in our return to school in the fall post-COVID-19. And the desired outcomes that we've set for our group, we have 7 of them. The first is around understanding of the stakeholders' perspectives as it relates to behavioral health. The second is a communication plan tailored to various stakeholders about our behavioral health work and the resources available. The third is a comprehensive plan for addressing adult behavioral needs for reopening. The fourth is a tiered professional learning plan. The fifth is community partnerships to support student and adult needs. The sixth is discipline policies for the 2021 school year for in-person and remote learning. And the seventh is a needs assessment guidance through the use of data. And so today, what we've been working on is that each of the desired outcomes is a subcommittee led by our steering committee members, and we are working to, is working really hard to develop our guidance by June 30th and make sure that our guidance is explicit for face-to-face and fully online environments that's in alignment with the plan's A, B, and C possibilities. And then second, we're also making sure that we're going to continue alignment work with our multi-tiered instructional steering committee to make sure we have consistency with schedules and the learning environments that will be established through that steering committee. And we're going to finalize guidance with our subcommittee and steering committee stakeholders for approvals with the reopening core team. And to just give you a sense of who is on our steering committee, I felt it was important to just review the areas and departments that are represented. In our steering committee, we have student support services, area superintendents, the academics department, special education services, office of professional learning, communications, and student due process. And within our subcommittees, we have, you see the list of central services membership that are on the left column. And then we have school-based stakeholders that include student and parents, along with teachers, principals, and counselors. And we also have community partners joining some of our subcommittees. For example, Alliance Health, Hope Services, Sigma Health, and Youth Thrive. And with this, some of the work that I felt like we wanted to just give you examples of, I just want to note that this is all work in progress. So we don't have a fully, polished document per se to share with you, but we wanted to share with you some of the examples to frame what we're working on. So this first example is around core behavioral health. And in the template that you see on the left of the slide is resources we're putting together for our school-based staff that are around the first week of school, the ongoing work and the resources connected to planning, transitions, building and sustaining relationships, teaching and supporting behavior expectations, down to supplemental intensive resources. And the document that you see on the right is actually a set of resources that we put together during when school was in session for in our remote learning environment. What are the best behavioral health practices for schools to enact during our synchronous and asynchronous learning? The second example, we're also doing research, to compile resources such as this from CASEL, where they're really highlighting these 3 signature practices that are related to welcoming and inclusion activities, engaging strategies, and optimistic closures. And below the images of the documents, you'll see a link to the full document that goes into detail about each of these signature practices. And then we're also, one of our subcommittees is working on the behavioral health and mental health services that are available both through community partnerships and that would be at a more intensive level at schools. And so some of the resources that we're outlining there are the student support services PLTs at the school sites and in central office, the Alliance Health referrals, individual and group counseling supports, school-based mental health services, and the communication that needs to be ongoing with our students and families as they go through the reopening efforts. And then the last example is to make sure that we're holding our adults and staff who are working both in central office and in our schools. So we've begun the development of adult social emotional learning and behavioral health supports. And so this is going to be a menu of professional learning for adults centered on adult SEL needs. And so those are some of the examples that we're working on. And of course, once we have them fully fleshed out, we would of course bring it both to our reopening core team and back to this board as necessary. With that, I'm going to just open it up for any questions and considerations that you'd like us to think about.
And Mrs. Mahaffey?
Thank you, Chair Sutton. Mr. Coe, this is certainly a big lift, and one of the themes that went through my BAC was certainly the social and emotional and mental health of our students, but also our staff members during this uncertain time. What is the anticipation for the core team, for your team, on how this is going to get pushed out to teachers so that they have time to go through this and make sure that they understand and are able to interact with behavioral health experts in order to better serve their students in their classrooms?
Yeah, so that's part of the responsibility of our steering committee to make sure that as these subcommittees finish their work, it gets brought to our steering committee and we vet the ideas to make sure that there's consistency and alignment. And then we bring it to the reopening core team. And in the core team, we talk together with, led by our communications team, on what's the time frame in which we're going to both release information, but then also make sure that there's training available. And that's why we're trying to make sure to have as much of our guidance drafted as soon as possible, so we could spend the month of July to think about the professional learning plans that we need for our school-based staff and central office staff.
I'm glad you said training, because I had written down, training for teachers specific to whether they want to learn different check-in protocols. I know we had talked in our BACs specifically about circles, but I know there are other methods for teachers as well, just so they can feel like they're ready for their classes. So I'm glad you brought that up. And, is there a thought as to ways we can push out information to parents on how to get how to talk to your child? I know you have some resources out already, but we're going to have kids that are feeling certain anxieties or what have you about coming back to school, and how do we address that up front, and how do we empower our parents to have those conversations with their students?
Yeah, that's a great question, Ms. Mahaffey. So that's part of our one of our subcommittees' work in terms of the comprehensive plans to various stakeholders. One of the pieces of work that our subcommittee is working on is tip sheets for parents that are about not just talking about the return to school, but also making sure that there's talking points on what the health guidelines mean for the child, particular younger ones, and how to discuss with students as a parent on what is happening and why we need to follow these health guidelines. And similarly, we're also developing resources within that subcommittee so that teachers and school-based staff will have resources on how to teach that and reinforce that as well at the school.
And aside from tip sheets, is there looking in, and I know we don't have a lot of time, to implement all of this, and I think tip sheets are a great start, but to make it multimodal, whether there is, not necessarily an interactive, but another way that parents can share that information with their children, especially younger children.
Yeah, I think that's a good suggestion and something I can bring back to our steering committee to make sure we're working on that. And I think, like I said, this is work in progress, so this input is very helpful.
Okay, and then I have one final question, and this has to do with the connection with academics, because that mental health piece and that social emotional piece is going to be even more important this year. Not that we're saying it's not very important and alongside academics, but in working with academics, our teachers have pacing guides and they have what they need to do that comes from DPI. Are we able to work with academics so that our teachers feel like they have the space to have those conversations with students?
And I think that's the purpose of our core reopening team, is to make sure we're aligned across all of our departments. But I think in this particular steering committee, making sure that we're working in alignment to eventually just make sure that there's a strong integration of both the behavioral health components and the content learning that needs to happen. So I think that's part of the lift. And I think, in some ways it's connected to the long-term goal where, as a district, with or without this COVID context, we want to make sure that work to develop an integration of things like social emotional learning with academic content continues to get strengthened.
Thank you, Mr. Coe. I appreciate it.
Thank you, Ms. Mahaffey. Ms. Kushner.
Thank you, Chair Sutton, and thank you, Mr. Coe, for that overview. I was wondering if we are looking into Medicaid and other funding, as well as other partners like advanced healthcare and some of the community-based health programs that can help us with mental health and with some funding.
Yes, ma'am. In terms of funding, I think it's going to be in alignment with how we're moving as a district in terms of like the additional funding that may come. But we're definitely, as a student support services team, we do use Medicaid funding to fund our efforts both in staff and programs. But in terms of one of our subcommittees that's related to the community partnerships, that's the work of that subcommittee where they're not just Alliance Health or Sigma Health or Hope Services. They're working together with stakeholders to make sure that we are broadening the community partnerships and strengthening them, because we know that the potential needs as we return to school might be greater, and some of the either traumas or crises situations that students and families have faced, we want to be ready for that, both from a mental health standpoint, but from a social worker lens along with the counselor lens. So I'm looking forward to seeing the furthering of the work of that subcommittee. And once we have additional updates, we'll bring that back.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's going to be important to look at the factors of community relationships, because we're going to need help with childcare. If we're going to a blended or any sort of AB schedule, we're going to need to support families and lean on community partners, whether it's the Y or Boys and Girls Club or other child care providers as a sort of a continuum. So as much as we can continue those partnerships and make sure that folks, not just our teachers and educators, but our bus drivers and cafeteria workers also get tip sheets or training to help each other, because it's a very stressful time, and I appreciate the overview, but I also can see how much needs to be done. So thank you for and I think that was, and I also wanted just to another factor to consider is just all the additional supports and help within the building that we will need. So I'm sure y'all are looking at all of that, but thank you.
Thank you, Ms. Kushner. Ms. Scott.
Thank you. Thank you, Mr. Code, for all of this. I really appreciated looking at the different documents that are available and also the links within those. So I have just a few questions. Do you have an idea with students being, I saw that students being part of the subcommittee working on providing feedback and guiding this. Do you know about how many students were part of, or have been part of these discussions?
Yeah, so it's not like a full cohort of students, but they're specifically identified through school-based relationships that our teams, our committees have. And also we took recommendations from our Office of Equity Affairs of students who've been on the school-based student equity teams. So there's about a list of like 6 to, I want to say maybe 10 students that we're reaching out to. And in some of our subcommittees, they're directly being involved with the subcommittee meetings in their regular meetings, while others are going to be consulted more in like a one-on-one or a smaller group basis to make sure we get their insights in regards to what we're up to.
Okay, I appreciate that, especially the older children become, the more we want to help them develop those skills. They become more competent rather at expressing their needs. And I think it's important to listen to that, and also to make sure there's a variety of students that are allowed to or that are encouraged to share their experience and their concerns. And one of the things I also appreciated looking at the adult social and emotional learning and health supports was the sentence that said, studies have found that adults who can recognize, understand, label, express, and regulate their own emotions can more effectively teach and model social emotional wellness for their students. And so, of course, as adults, we're all processing this across the spectrum of concerns. I, I'm sure that Dr. Matillo will be able to go into a little bit about what supports are going to be in place for our staff to also make sure that self-care is available for them. I was curious, though, with given how complex this is, knowing I was just in a training yesterday to do with social and emotional learning. This was geared towards school board members, and they spent a long time talking about ACEs. And of course, all of us who are involved in this work are familiar with adverse childhood experiences and also the process that happens when you are in sort of a constant state of stress and you're in that fight or flight mode, and what kind of opportunities there are to model better behavior. I do worry. I'm not the first person to bring this concern to light, but I do worry about the potential for bullying behavior in kids, where you have some kids who are going to be very nervous and they're going to be wearing masks, and is somebody going to make fun of them for wearing a mask, or pretend to cough on them, or just the potential for situations like that, and trying to teach children why that's not okay. Unfortunately, we see on the media that adults aren't necessarily setting a great example sometimes in how we should be treating each other right now. And that can have a serious impact on a student's ability to access the curriculum if they are constantly in that state of being afraid. So are there any supports from that standpoint yet that are being considered?
Yes, ma'am. Absolutely, there is. And I think that's where the work of what the core behavioral health work needs to be. It's on the slide that that has the desired outcomes, the comprehensive plan to various stakeholders. One of the examples I gave was the core behavioral health work, and in there, we wanted to make sure that there's a good on-ramp, so that we don't just return to school and say, okay, everyone, let's just go straight to content, but make sure we're giving schools resources on how to build a reconnectedness in the school as they return. And it might not be just first week, but maybe like the first 6 weeks, we need to make sure that we're providing resources of what that on-ramp could look like. And then I think where that intersects with making sure that we're providing effective guidance around the needs assessment. So that's the last desired outcome we have as a steering committee, to make sure that we're being precise, like you said, about ACEs. We can't assume that all kids will come with ACEs, but the ones that do, we want to make sure not to just like lump them into the general student population, but make sure that we have intensive supports or supplemental supports that are specific to what they might be going through, whether that's through one-on-one or smaller group services and supports. And then I think it's also making sure that with our adults, I think this is where the adult learning plan also is important, where the strategies that we've taught through CRIM, during this past year with the community resiliency model, restorative practices, and also this adult SEL learning plan that's being developed and that has been implemented, that how do those intersect, so that that constant emphasis on relationship building and making sure we're meeting each other where we're at. And it's also that our students who are in a constant state of stress, instead of forcing them to just focus on content, we have actual strategic services for populations like our McKinney-Vento students, or students who are in our foster care system, or youth who have, like maybe have seen a sea change in their family in terms of economic situations, or just their general well-being. I think we're trying to make sure we're being specific about the populations that we want to support in a targeted way. So we're working on that, but that is definitely on our radar.
I really appreciate that, and I thank you for that. I know sometimes, there are criticisms or questions about why we are spending, time and money on these types of issues. But our job as a school system is to ensure that every child has access to education. And we know that the data and the supports that you have to understand this side of of school and of life in order for those kids to be able to access that curriculum and the content that's put in front of them. And the two truly go hand in hand. And so I thank you so much for this work. And I look forward to hearing more about the partnerships as well that we'll be able to have with our community partners in terms of mental health. Thank you very much, Mr. Coe.
Thank you, Mrs. Scott.
Thank you, Ms. Scott. I got time for one more question on this topic. Ms. Johnson-Hosmer.
Thank you. And I think it will be quick because I think you've addressed most of them, Mr. Coe. So I only actually have one comment that I'll make. Both Ms. Kushner and Ms. Scott expressed my concerns, not just about our students, but about all of our staff. So my quick question is, have we used the state's training on the mental health training? I think Chris, actually, Mr. Haggerty has also brought this up. It's the mental health first aid. That's I think it's like a day-long training that I think might be really helpful for quite a few of our folks, even our transportation people, because it's quick and short and it's by the state, and it gives, in Ms. Scott's feedback, it gives some tips for adults to kind of think through, not just for themselves for coping, but also dealing with young people. So that's my first question or recommendation, because it's supported by Safer Schools of North Carolina, and they actually do the training for free. I haven't checked their online training schedule, but that's definitely a module that's been validated as a training that could be helpful. And then the second thing that I want to say based on your feedback, and I appreciate the targets, but I also want to acknowledge, and I don't know if they talked about this at the training that you went to, Mrs. Scott, but COVID is going to be a part of ACEs. It's not built in yet, but it truly is and has impacted all people, but also our young people. And so when we define trauma, COVID fits squarely into the way the DSM acknowledges that. And so I just want us to be thoughtful about that, and I know you are, Mr. Coe, but something to think about for our staff and administrators as they're welcoming students both back in person and online, is that it wouldn't be what we would normally see as a part of their trauma history, but certainly has impacted our students. And the language that a lot of therapists have been using for young people is grief, and that they're experiencing grief exactly the way that they would if they lost a person right now as an impact of COVID. So the 7 stages. So just something to put on the radar as you and the other teams are looking at how we're going to address this and what does the targeted efforts look like for both our students and the adults that we work with. And certainly thank you for all the work that you continue to lead, and the thoughtfulness and intentionality that you have around our students and our adults, educators, and administrators.
Yes, Ms. Johnson-Hosler. So first of all, thank you for that suggestion. I'll have to check on to what degree our staff have been exposed, but I think that's a resource that's available, and we'll definitely add it to the toolkits. And I think your point about the COVID is a new lens that we need to develop. I think that's something that our folks are definitely thinking about, because the impact of COVID is, potentially a myriad of things that are not just economic, but the loss of loved ones and our elders. So I think all those things are a part of the targeted groups that we need to be thinking about. And so we appreciate your suggestions.
Thank you.
All right. Thank you all for those questions, and thank you, Dr. Coe, for the presentation and the update. Dr. Gardner, I'll turn it back over to you for our next.
Thank you, Chair Sutton, and thank you, Dr. Coe, for that information you've shared. And board, thank you for the questions you had, as well as the additional factors you identified as we continue to unpack these streams of work, in particular this one around our emotional and mental welfare of our students. This is the purpose of these sections within these work sessions, as we discuss the planning considerations with you and share with you how the different teams off of the core planning team have begun to impact them, for us to hear from you the factors that you want us to consider as well, if we have not identified them in some of the discussion that we've shared with you. And as anticipated, this next topic of human resources has critical impact from the situation we find ourselves in with COVID-19 and the restart of the school year. And I invite AJ Matillo to come forward now and share with you information about our staffing. This has been a topic of great interest for you as a board, as well as for us community and school-based personnel. And so I'm excited to have the opportunity to invite him to our discussion now as he impacts the planning considerations around human resources. Mr. Matillo.
Thank you, sir, and thank you to the board for this opportunity to share an update with you today from our HR steering committee. Our team's work so far has been focused on drafting guidance on HR policies and procedures related to COVID-19 and developing plans to support the district's staffing needs under whatever A, B, and C plan ultimately ends up looking like. We also remain committed to our 20,000 plus employees to ensure that they feel supported and informed as we move through the beginning of the 2021 school year. You can see our desired outcomes there in front of you, and obviously the staffing plans for A, B, and C are primary in our work, but we've also been working to look at things like student membership, to look at things like policies and how we support those areas, as well as a plan to support the employee wellness and morale. I heard that reference during the last session, so I will touch on that a little bit today as we go through this. Obviously, employees are very key to our work, and we want to ensure that we support them in every way that we can as they support student learning. So before I share some of the work our steering committee has been engaged in, I wanted to take an opportunity to share some relevant data from an employee survey that we received just yesterday. So there will be plans to share more of this with you, but we just received the data yesterday, and it was very much relevant to things that our steering committee has been talking about and things that I will discuss today. So I felt like it'd be important to at least share some of that with you as it relates to our employees. The data in this surveys both validates much of what we've already been considering, but will also inform our work as we finalize and communicate plans with our employees. As a matter of context for the data that I'm going to share, we had 10,686 school-based staff respond to the survey. So more than 60% of those respondents were teachers, and the next largest group were IAs at 16%. So making this data sort of further significant for us is the fact that 63% of our total teachers responded and 65% of our total IAs responded to the survey. So when we look at it, while certainly it's not 100% response rate, it is a very large percentage of our teachers and our IAs at the school level. So it does have meaning for us as we look at it. As you can see from this slide, this first one here, feedback from school-based staff somewhat mirrors the overall feedback from our parents, although the percentage might vary slightly. But they're divided somewhat evenly among the three different options, with a heavier leaning toward the blended school and home model. And when we talk school and home model, we are talking about instruction that occurs both in classrooms face-to-face as well as continued online learning. So this slide here asks how comfortable employees would be with the following scenarios, and it's hard for you to see some of this. So again, I'll add a little bit of context. The green bar at the top of each graph signifies a very uncomfortable rating. So green is very uncomfortable, where the dark blue is uncomfortable. Yellow moves toward comfortable, and light blue is very comfortable. So those are your sort of colors there. Your two graphs on the left really include feedback on what would be the equivalent of a possible plan A as outlined by DPI. The graph at the left shows top left shows comfort with returning to school in a similar fashion to where we left in March with very few differences. And the graph at the bottom left shows returning to school in a similar fashion, but with significant adjustments to help mitigate the spread, such as social distancing, wearing of face coverings, health screenings, a lot of things that have been talked about under that DPI's proposed Plan A. It's no surprise that in the graph at the top left, 66% of our employees would feel uncomfortable returning to schools as we knew them when we closed down in March. It's significant that the data at the bottom left graph, which again closely mirrors that Plan A, indicates 58% of our school-based employees would remain uncomfortable. Our staff become a bit more comfortable with a return under Plan B, where this is a blended face-to-face instruction in schools and continued remote learning during certain days or weeks. However, it is important to note that 35% of our school-based staff would continue to remain uncomfortable, and that's your graph in the top right of your slide. And then the last graph at the bottom right shows staff comfort level under Plan C, which would be a fully online model, and we see that 72% of our staff indicate they would be comfortable. It's hard to know exactly what went into the ratings, but I get the sense that as folks talk about being uncomfortable and all remote, it may not necessarily be about their safety and health, but more the instruction for kids. How do I balance my home life and those kinds of things? So just looking at that, there's certainly lots of information for us as an HR steering committee to continue to look at as we develop and finalize plans. At the next graph there, just one more. I don't want to present a ton of data today. I want to talk a little bit more about what we're actually doing. But I feel like this is fairly relevant to our HR steering committee work. In this graph, you'll see that just over half of our school-based employees consider themselves or someone that they are living with as high risk for COVID-19. I know we will all sort of take away different things from this data. One takeaway I note is that our employees are divided in terms of their preference for potential options and slightly favor a sort of Plan B model, with 43% indicating it as a preference, versus 28 and 29 for the other models. From our HR steering committee's work, this data also communicates a level of discomfort from our employees heading into the school year, regardless of the plan. And we touched upon this a little bit in the last session, that we have to be cognizant of that to support the needs of our staff, regardless of the plan that we end up implementing. So this makes the work of our steering committee is very important as we continue to develop plans for our employees, not just to ensure the instruction and the operations of the district, but to ensure that we keep them safe and emotionally well and healthy. What I hope you get a sense of today is just some of what our steering committee is working on and engaged in, and the factors that we are trying to consider as we look at finalizing our plans. And toward the end of the segment, there will be time for questions. And I also really look forward to your feedback on other factors that you would like us to consider as we finalize some of our plans. I want to start a little bit with staffing plans for schools. And a lot of our work is focused on some processes and procedures that we know we need to implement regardless of what type of plan we end up implementing next year. We are very close to finalizing a work accommodations request process for employees who would be at high risk of developing severe illness if they contracted COVID-19. And this is a process that is required by the Department of Health and Human Services. As a reminder, the CDC is currently defining individuals who are considered high risk for severe illness due to COVID-19 the following ways. One, that people who are 65 years of age and older, and then people of all ages who have underlying health conditions such as lung disease, moderate or severe asthma, serious heart disease, compromised immune system, diabetes, chronic kidney disease, those kinds of things. Under the process we are developing now, employees who self-identify as high risk would submit an accommodations request to our office, and then we would review that accommodation request and try to work with the employee for a plan to keep them safe and able to do their job in an effective manner. And some of the accommodations could include things like enhanced PPE, additional cleaning of the employee's workspace, limiting access to the person's workspace by others, using physical barriers, adjusting work hours where it's appropriate. And teleworking would also be one of those options. So we've identified some things we know we can do, especially for our high-risk employees that are above the baseline of what we might provide as a district to ensure their safety. And then throughout this process, HR, while they'll manage the process, we will communicate with principals just to make sure that what we are suggesting and working with the employee can be implemented effectively. Also looking at screening and other additional responsibilities. I've heard lots of feedback just through surveys, through board meetings and such, that with a lot of the extra provisions that we'll have to take next year, we need, some of that will obviously fall on schools, and we need to be able to support how they handle additional responsibilities. So one of our goal of our staffing plans will be to mitigate that as best as we can on teachers and other school-based staff. We need to be creative and strategic as we identify additional staff members who could help. You know, one of the things that our committee is thinking about is how can we deploy central services staff to the schools, especially during some of those high traffic times, to help with health screenings, temperature checks, supervision needs, and those kinds of things. We also have employees who don't always work a full 8-hour day based on their job responsibilities. There might be a way to wrap some of those employees in and be able to compensate them for additional hours. So we're thinking through just trying to ensure that we are not putting strategies in place that only fall on the shoulders of our school-based employees, and we're using everybody that we can to help mitigate that impact. Looking at roles and responsibilities of all staff under all plans, this is important because we know regardless of the plan, it's going to have different impacts for different groups of employees. And I think that's, as we finished up a lot of our documents and guidance, that is what we're moving into right now in terms of with every single plan and every single employee group, what are the factors, what are the considerations that we have to take into account? And certainly working closely with that, we can support the needs of the academics team. Moving, another key area we've been looking at is substitute teachers. Substitute teachers already play a large role for us in the district. They've always online option for the district, making sure that roles and responsibilities of employees are defined, ensuring that there is a selection process that's appropriate for those options, and making sure that folks are prepared to implement it. We've heard a lot about the emergency switch we had to pull in March to remote learning and not having the time to train staff. So we are reaching out to Office of Professional Learning, places like SCORE and Flex Academy, who do have some remote teachers already, to learn from some of the things that they've been doing. We've been looking at the structure of it as well. Is it better to have this remote academy sort of housed with the current school so we keep the resources there? Do we look at setting up a separate school code and utilizing it? That would then mean moving resources potentially away from a school. So we're trying to weigh the positives and the challenges of each of those decisions, and working with budget and other departments to do that. Also looked at operationalizing a lot of our HR policies. This is where we've accomplished much of our work thus far, because we know regardless of the plan that we need to have these things in place. So we have 4 documents that are in the final review process and expect them to be finalized pretty soon, around guidance for employee leave, around teleworking for both schools and central services, the accommodation request process that I mentioned as well. So those are some of the things that we're also currently working through. And we continue to work closely with communications to ensure that our guidance is shared appropriately. We have several principals on our HR steering committee, and that has come up in every single action step. So we know that it's not a separate action step. It's something that has to be in place for everything. Also looking at student membership for us and flexibility in how we count students. Lots of different departments are impacted by how students are counted at the HR level. It impacts ADM at the schools. So we've been working with budget closely and really advocating with the state for some flexibility on how we count students. Next, I want to talk a little bit about supporting employee wellness and morale. We went into that a little bit in the last presentation. One of the things is the childcare needs of our staff. That's been brought up a few times, and with state of emergency leave, it provided a lot of good support for our teachers. But as we move and don't have state of emergency leave right now, and we're looking at the federal leave, the FFCRA leave, that does allow 12 weeks of leave for if a child's daycare or school is closed, but that is very limited to really some of the leave options that our employees might need in terms of caring for kids. So we recognize that this is critical to find additional ways to support our staff. And we're working through that, both how can we creatively do that with existing resources, but really looking towards some of our community partners to see how they can support in this area. Also want to talk a little bit about the emotional support and morale. We know that these are challenging times for employees. We've heard a lot about that. We'll continue to work with Paul Coe and his team to provide resources for our employees, but also looking at our employee assistance program. That's a resource that we generally have used after an employee has sort of once they've needed it, when they're in a crisis kind of state. But they have lots of resources there, seminars and other additional resources around employee wellness, around dealing with isolation, work-home balance, things that really could help our employees. So we're working with that group to also provide some additional resources for our employees. We're also looking at how to use some of the resources from our traditional employee recognition programs. As you know, we were unable to have Teacher of the Year last year. With Principal of the Year in the fall, there might be a challenge there as well. We're not having our employee recognition coming through the board meetings anymore. So we're really looking at how we use the resources to really let folks know that we do support them, that we are thinking about them, and can provide recognition and appreciation that way. I want to talk a little bit about hiring in our more traditional sense. How are we filling the openings that we currently have? And we have been very fortunate through the process of digitizing personnel files, as well as implementing a virtual employee orientation, that we've continued to hire without interruption. The digital personnel files allow hiring managers, such as principals, assistant principals, to look at those files without having to come to a physical space. And obviously, onboarding and orientation for our employees that happens virtually also allows us to keep moving forward and keep those employees safe. All of our staffing plans from schools have been reviewed and processed. This is a time of year where generally we are still finishing up, especially our traditional calendar staffing plans, and we've been able to finish processing all of those so that we know as July comes and some needs might shift, as a department, we have a bulk of that work done so that we can be nimble and responsive to the needs of the district. Just looking at some of the hiring stats there, we've hired 663 new hires, as you'll see, and 940 rehires. The rehires are a large bucket of employees that could include somebody who's left the system and come back, but it could be simply hiring somebody who was on a terminating contract at the end of the year and rehiring them in that space. So we feel good about where we are with hiring and look forward to supporting academics and the schools and other departments and central services with their needs. So just as some sort of next steps for us, again, it's finalizing, sharing guidance, really defining the plans for staffing schools under the 3 models, and also looking at the needs and the structures of the online option, and really maintaining a focus on supporting employee wellness and morale. And I think one of the things that has weighed heaviest on my mind is knowing that as we transition into next year, we have a very strong obligation, obviously, to provide the best instruction for our students. That has to be primary, but also looking at keeping our employees safe, healthy while they do that. And that has been a sort of a balancing act that we have looked at throughout this and will continue to consider to ensure that our employees are healthy, are safe, their needs are taken care of so that they can then meet the needs of the kids. I think at this time, I'm happy to take questions that you have and also additional feedback that you have as we develop our future plans. Thank you.
All right. Thank you, Dr. Matillo. I'm going to start with Ms. Cash. Questions?
Yeah, thank you. The slide where you showed that the significant amount of people that we felt were either at a healthcare risk or live with someone with a healthcare risk in our personnel. I was considering the fact that I know that Wake Med just recently did a similar study with their employees. I think their healthcare employees face a lot of the same challenges, like their childcare issues that they're facing to come to work at the hospital. similar challenges. I know the employee population of healthcare providers nationally and in Wake County is similar and maybe a little higher as far as age of employees. And of course, their access to risk is significant, as well as our teachers will be for being near a large population of students. Is there more that you will, I think the number of people at Wake Med was not quite as high that felt like they would be at risk to come to work. Do you know how we look deeper into that as far as the reasoning?
Yeah, right now we are as a committee looking at what additional questions we need to ask folks in order to get more information. We do know more information will come once we ask folks who are high risk to request work accommodation. So we'll get information there. Have looked at the number of teachers who are over the age of 65, but also know that that's only a small factor. And some of those folks may not self-identify as a high risk, where other ages of employees who have health concerns will. So we are looking at some of that data and we'll certainly follow up with staff to get some additional information.
And I thought maybe there's been quite a bit of research done on that in the Wake Med systems, because of course they had to keep their employees at work through the whole time. So I don't know whether there's something that there can be some communication between Wake Med, since it is a county funded operation, and the Wake County Public School System, as maybe how they accessed just what employees they feel like would work or not work.
Yeah, that's a great idea, and we'll certainly put that on the list to reach out to them.
Thank you.
Ma'am, thank you.
Mr. Fletcher, thank you.
Thank you. AJ, is high risk the only factor for workplace accommodations?
That is the only factor that's really included in the DHHS guidance. However, we also know we need to be more accommodating than that. So a lot of our, telework procedures and some of the other things we're considering we are looking at employees' needs who wouldn't be identified as high risk per the DHHS guidance.
Some of this seems to be somewhat of a catch-22. How many teachers will come to the building? Could tell us how many students we can have in the building. At the same time, how many students come to the building will tell us how many teachers we need in the building. And the 50% of the staff who responded saying that they are either they themselves or they are living with someone who is a high risk for COVID is challenging. I think previous numbers we've seen in some surveys have been somewhere between 20 and 30% of parents have suggested they would prefer to keep their children at home until whatever. And so I'm trying to, 30% for us is close to 50,000 kids. In fact, it might be more than 50,000 kids. We've talked a lot about what a blended, well, we haven't talked about what a blended schedule is. We've talked about what blended schedules might be. And I don't understand how that will work for families who have to go to work and would not be available to provide childcare. So it seems that your decisions made in your area of HR and how we're going to support our employees and keep them deal with their personal concerns and keep them employed and working productively with students is really the driver for many, many other decisions. How many students can we transport to school with the budget that we have? That's, I appreciate what you've done and the opportunities that you've shared today. I'm just thinking that your area is the place that ultimately will be where decisions have to be made that others follow. And keeping our teachers gainfully engaged in teaching, doing instruction and helping students learn whether it's remote or whether it's in person, I think is a critical factor for us as a district to assure that we get it right. And so I'll just add that comment. So thank you for your presentation.
Yeah, and thank you for that comment. And I have worked closely with the other departments already, you know, their health services and academics. This is just one of those, we've had lots of conversations, and yes, where sort of some of our decisions drive the needs, we also want to make sure that we're all together on the front end and coordinated with whatever strategy we roll out. And like you, that the 50% number was higher than I had seen as well. So we will continue to unpack that as a committee. Thanks, Mr. Fletcher.
Thank you, Mr. Fletcher. Mr. Hagerty.
Thank you, Mr. Sutton. Again, AJ, I want to thank you for your presentation. It was very thorough. You covered a lot of ground. One thing that, when you were talking about trying to come up with more support in the schools, for example, to assist with screenings and to assist with other functions that staff or schools will have to take on associated with COVID, it got me thinking. There's a tremendous amount of instructional support that in a normal environment is provided by PTAs, room parents, volunteers, and with potential restrictions on outsiders in the building. I didn't know if you had any strategies, for example, when you talked about substitute teachers, if there was the chance of additional support staff coming on to even assist with things like filing documentation and paperwork, you know, that's required in some of the classes. I was just curious. We hadn't given a lot of thought to that before, but some of your remarks made me think a little bit deeper about how much goes into running the school. And I was just curious if you had any options that you could present.
Yeah, we have given it some thought, I think, other than right now looking at subs, looking at positions that are not classroom based, that really can support. You mentioned some of the instructional support. I do think volunteers could be an option in some situations. You know, obviously there will be restrictions around the medical piece, but they could potentially provide a need elsewhere if we have to bring other staff into something like a screening situation. So it is something that we'll continue to work through. I appreciate that comment.
Thank you. Do you think that under our volunteer policies, we could have the capacity for virtual volunteers, or could we have something like that under our current policy, or would we need to change that if potentially like remote volunteers can't come into the school to use the traditional volunteer sign up?
Is your question around getting them approved remotely or volunteering remotely? Make sure I understand.
It's a little of both. If we have the potential for them to volunteer remotely, you know, if they're unable to come in the building, are we able to get them cleared remotely?
Yeah, there is a process. We've explored this a couple times, and I've looked into it, and I think there is a way that we can do that and get them approved remotely. So we can certainly continue to look into that. That's a good idea. Yeah, I don't know much. I would have to look at the volunteer policy a little bit more thoroughly again, but that is another interesting idea to pursue, and we'll certainly take a look at it.
Thank you very much.
Yes, sir. Thanks, Mr. Hagerty.
Thank you, Mr. Hagerty. Mrs. Scott.
Thank you. AJ, thank you as well for all of this information. I'll try to be quick. I know we still have more information to go over, but thinking about that 10-day head count, and there was the talking about advocating for, I can't find the slide, to look into that for allotments. What can you give a quick summary of where we're at right now in terms of for student membership, and you know, what sort of parameters we're working with?
Yeah, I mean, at a very high level, sort of a simple level, in order for us to count a student, they have to be physically present at the building. And obviously that is not going to be necessarily a reality for all students. So we've been reaching out to state partners, and hopefully that flexibility is coming. We just don't want to take it for granted. And then
Have you
it also
received,
kind of,
I was
sorry.
just going to say, have you received any feedback from partners at the state level on what any sort of, hint towards what they're anticipating could happen?
Yeah, not that I've seen yet. They know it's a concern. So I know that they're looking into it, but just haven't received that guidance yet.
Okay, because I imagine that, I mean, that's clearly every school district has parents who are going to want to access a virtual environment, a virtual learning environment right now. I know this had been discussed in the last work session that we had. It had been brought up as a potential to use educators, AIG teachers, and in different roles other than their intended role. Have we been able to work more to make sure that they are able to maintain their intended role and work on their intended position and not be pulled into core classrooms if we have to use the plan B?
Yeah.
There's been more work to secure, to ensure those teachers that, or assure those teachers rather, that their defined role is what they'll be able to do.
Is your question essentially using some of our instructional support in different ways next year?
Not instructional support. I'm talking specifically about, our AIG teachers, our band teachers, PE teachers, to make sure that they are still able to work within their subject, their field, their specialty.
Yeah, I don't think we've specifically looked at that yet, but we'll certainly put it on the list. We want to ensure that students continue to be well-rounded and receive instruction in all the different modes that they do. So that's certainly a priority of ours. We'll take a look at that.
Okay.
Yeah, this is Dr. McFarland. I can respond to that, Ms. Scott. We are working to ensure that folks will remain in their designated areas as much as possible and to the extent possible within all of the options that we're looking at, because we know that's important for our students. It's also important for our staff.
Absolutely. Okay. Yeah, I appreciate that. I know Ms. Mahaffey had doubled back to ask about that at our last work session. And, as a former music teacher, as you are as well, I just want to make sure that we are working to make sure that those educators are still able to work in their specialty and acknowledging how important their subject matter is and their roles are as they're regularly defined. And that was said. Thank you so much.
Yeah, thank you, Ms. Scott.
Thank you, Ms. Scott. Dr. Martin.
Thank you. Comment and two questions. First, a comment. With respect to, some kind of a virtual school or whatnot, I again would like to express my concern about creating a whole new school code. I understand that might be required for head counts, but other than that, I would be quite concerned about setting up a separate school, because anytime you set up a separate school, that's going to draw resources away from existing schools. And we started from a position where our existing schools were resource shy. So I'd be very reluctant to setting up yet another sort of complete organization and thinking about the assignment issues that would go with that. I really want to make sure that we protect our existing schools and the resources going to them. So that's my comment. Particularly on slide 33, you note that we got to work on how do schools support handling additional responsibilities. And then your next bullet also was about defining roles and responsibilities for employee groups, including adjustment of responsibilities for instructional assistants. I want to express a little bit of concern on, particularly for our TAs, because I think their work is going to be even more important than in the past with students coming back. There's going to be incredibly more additional needs for sort of one-on-one work. Anybody who's looked at any kind of virtual instruction knows, or remote instruction knows, that it actually is more capital intensive, not less. you can have 3 classrooms of 30 students each and deal with 90 students face to face. But trying to deal with 90 students in a remote setting is a completely different picture. So my point here is that for a lot of things, everywhere from the classroom to staffing and whatnot, I think we're going to be needing more personnel, not just readjusting the roles of existing personnel. What I heard sounded a little bit more like adjusting existing personnel. Can you tell us a little bit more about the new versus readjusting roles that's going on in your thinking and planning?
Yeah, so thank you for bringing that up. I want to be clear that when I was talking about sort of adjusting responsibilities of IAs, it's still focusing on instruction. They were one group that we heard from in March when we went remote and needed some additional guidance on how do I support the teacher, how do I support the students in this virtual environment. So that's really where that comment was coming from. Right now, before we look at budget implications, we have been looking at, how do we adjust roles? How do we use everybody in the district to help support the schools around the additional needs that they're going to have? Certainly, there is an option to add additional staff. It just comes with a cost. When you look at, one teacher, for example, with benefits and everything else, a first-year teacher costs us about $60,000 for the district. Think of adding one teacher at every school. That's a price tag of $11.5 million just for one teacher at a school. So we just know we're going to be constrained by budget, and that's why we've been thinking along the lines of utilizing current personnel. But certainly we're also thinking about the areas where we do need to add additional, and how do we fund that, and how do we hire for that, and those kinds of things. So we are thinking about it.
And I appreciate that thinking. I think, here's where we as educators have this tendency to, we'll work with whatever we're given to try to make it work. And we do a pretty good job of that. But in times like this, there is a breaking point. I've talked about the one teacher per school, is $11 to $12 million a lot, because I think that communicates in the public, but we've said before COVID, we needed one nurse per school, not one nurse per 2 schools. We need that even more now. So there really is a budgetary implication here. And I think the sooner we start articulating that and communicating it, the better we're going to be, because I don't believe we can simply accommodate with our current staff. Yeah. Related to that, then my second question is, you gave us the numbers of the new and rehires, but what are we hearing in terms of retirements, those planning to leave? And I'm thinking about both teachers, teaching assistants, or instructional assistants, staff. I would be very surprised if we would not see an increase in retirements, particularly given that we learned that 50% of our staff either are at high risk or have family members who are at high risk. So I'm glad the hiring numbers are looking reasonable, but what are we hearing on the retirement leaving? Or is it too premature to get that information yet?
Yeah, so our hiring season, or our retiring season, I guess, sometimes happens, or resignations, more into the July months, because even though we guarantee folks they'll receive benefits through a certain point in time, teachers get a little nervous about, letting us know right away. So it really kind of will start kicking off. We do monitor the numbers. I don't have them at the tip of my fingers right now, but just based anecdotally from staff, we're kind of seeing normal retirement and resignation numbers. But again, those tend to pick up in July, and we'll make sure that we monitor them closely. And that's been one of the reasons why we've been so focused on getting through our current staffing plans, our current new hires, so that we can be in a position to recruit as these new retirees or resignations occur.
Okay, thank you, and keep us informed. Thank you.
Yes, sir.
Thank you, Dr. Martin. Ms. Mahaffey.
Thank you, Chair Sutton, and thank you, Dr. Matillo. In talking about what our support staff is going to be able to do. I've heard a lot of concerns from our IAs, front office staff, and our bus drivers in what their role would be during Plan B or Plan C specifically. What kind of, they still are dependent on us for a paycheck, and of course we want to keep them. We don't want to lose bus drivers. How are we working to make sure that our support staff, who are essential to our school system running, are making sure that they still feel valued and have something to do, but are also safe during those times?
Yeah, so I think we're school-based support staff. We feel pretty good that regardless of the plan, the work is going to be there. It might just look a little different. Obviously, under a Plan C, where students are not reporting to schools, we're not transporting and feeding students, then we need to look out for our drivers and our CNS staff. And they have been just incredible over the course of the last couple months, being flexible, helping with food distribution needs. I mean, they've just been sort of our boots on the ground, employees really helping the district out. So we will continue to work with transportation. I've talked with the transportation department probably more in the last couple months than I have even as a high school principal. But we're in close communication about how do we ensure through whether it be leave policies or work or whatever the case may be, that we can keep these folks in a paid status, because we can't afford to lose them. We've talked about how they are sort of the backbone of our organization in a lot of ways, and we struggle to recruit in those areas. So while I don't have specific plans yet under a C especially kind of plan, it is something that we are working closely with both CNS and transportation on. When I think of the other two plans and those employees, especially when I think of what a Plan A might look like for a bus driver, I think that's where we really start to look at the feasibility of all these different options, and putting a bus driver either on a school bus with lots of kids, or having them to add to their drive times and their routes. So we are looking at how do we keep them safe, how do we keep them feel valued, and how do we support them in what other additional needs they'll have under any of the plans.
Yeah, and I heard from bus drivers specifically wanting to know for sure which of their students will be taking the bus, because they need up to 3 weeks to get their routes down, and our routing staff also needs time to plan the routes. So I know that's not your department, but just wanted to make sure. I'm sure Bob is on here somewhere. My next question goes to the health and safety of our teachers and all staff members. As we know, teachers right now, if they have to take a sick day, they're required to pay what I view as a penalty of $50 for a sub, contributing $50 towards getting that sub. If we have a teacher who tests for COVID, right now we're in a 3-day waiting period before they even know if they're positive or negative, and that's $150 there coming out of their pocket. Are we able to use CARES money to cover that sub pay for teachers? Or I noticed, I believe it was not even in the bill from the General Assembly. I think it specifically said that teachers would be required to still pay that $50.
Yeah, so the DPI referenced the $50 deduction for extended sick leave. And there is a deduction there, but for regular sick leave, the sick leave that employees accrue 1 day a month throughout their entire career, there's not a deduction for that. So I think we're in pretty good shape there. I think you brought it up at the last meeting about that $50 deduction. So I've been reviewing
HR, so I figured I'd better ask you.
Yeah, so I've actually been looking into that to see if there is any flexibility. I don't have answers yet, but it's something that we're exploring in order to help employees out, especially if there's a diagnosis of COVID. The federal leave does provide some full day pay depending on the reason, some at a 2/3 pay. And as recently as the last couple of days, we have found a way within our systems to allow teachers to, or any employee, to supplement 2/3 with some of their own leave, so that they can remain in full paid status. So we're really exploring any flexibility, any option that we have to support employees who need to take leave, ensure that they can stay as fully paid as possible.
Right. Just like we'll be pushing to parents that we do not want them sending their children to us if they're, presumed positive or feeling under the weather. We want to make sure that we can guarantee that same thing as a district, that we're not putting our employees in a position where they feel like they have to go to work so they can get paid. So thank you for that. And I know there are a lot of folks looking for further guidance, and I'm sure that'll come out as it comes along. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. Thanks, Ms. Mackey.
Thank you, Ms. Mahaffey. Ms. Kushner.
Thank you, Chair Sutton. And I mainly wanted to agree with Dr. Martin about and share my concerns about setting up a different school for remote learning. I think we need to do whatever we can. And I understand you might have limitations, Dr. Matillo, but we need to do whatever we can to support our school community so they have some stability in enrollment, so that our teacher allotments, I don't need to tell you, are stable. So just wanted to add that comment. And I think to something Mr. Fletcher said earlier, it's not so much a catch-22 as a paradox, that our students and our families are rightfully concerned at the developmental risks of our students being out of school longer and not having the instruction that their families think they need. Whereas the risks to our employees, the health and safety risks around this virus, are also understandably more pronounced in adults. So I think it's more a paradox that you're having to piece together, and whatever we can do to support that, because I think that's a big wall to climb. So I appreciate that, that the information that you shared today. And and I think most of my questions have been answered by my colleagues who've been very thorough, but I really wanted to underscore whatever we can do. And if it's working with other school districts in North Carolina to get the flexibility that we need at the state level to do communities in a stable and sound way, please engage the board, engage whatever leadership you need so that we can get that flexibility to you and your staff. Thank you.
Yes, ma'am. Thanks, Ms. Kushner.
Thank you, Mrs. Kushner. Let me just check on a few of these hands. I don't know if you have additional questions. Ms. Cash, did you have an additional question?
I do. I have one quick one. First, I do want to clarify that it's no longer a 3-day waiting for a positive on a COVID. It's 90 minutes in all the hospitals and urgent cares. So it isn't quite the same turnaround. But when we have, when we meet the needs, as we look at choices made by our parents mainly, and sometimes our teachers, and what type of learning they want to do, I still am concerned about what type of accountability we hold as far as participation. I think that as we talk to different, and I think this is probably best done by a principal per school. Some schools have great participation by their teachers and by their students. And I'm hoping that we don't forget to look at that. What type of participation is done in our schools, as far as if a teacher wants to remote teach, are they really getting a great participation in the classroom? And even more so, if a student chooses to only participate by remote, are they actually participating at a high rate? I know we're going to be accountable for all the test grades that come out later, so I'd hope that we would be accountable for who's online. Thanks.
Yes, ma'am. Thank you.
Thank you, Mrs. Cash. Mr. Haggerty.
Yes, thank you, Mr. Sutton. Before we move on, I wanted to go back and address some comments from Dr. Martin and from Ms. Kushner, and I apologize to Dr. Matillo. I know, this is your segment, and we don't expect you to be the expert on all things related to virtual academy and some of these other options, and some of the details might actually be better answered by other members of the senior leadership team. But I wanted to address their concerns about the impact of a virtual academy on our other schools and just share with them that around the state, other districts have moved forward with this idea where rather than setting up a new school, they've set it up as a program with a program code that has already been approved by DPI. And so, for example, Winston-Salem and Forsyth County schools are able to set up their virtual academy where there's no pay cut, no lack of resources for the kids participating, for the students participating, because they're still assigned to their base school. It's almost like a homebound program or something like that. You know, as we go forward, you know, with the idea that the board endorsed at our last work session for an academy, I think these are all very legitimate, important questions that are being asked, but I don't want anyone watching the meeting to think that these are obstacles, that there are other districts that have sort of pioneered, that have put these programs together and have been approved. And in some of these, again, they are almost all of them smaller districts than ours, but the initial results, the initial things that we're being told are very positive, including the ability to staff these academies with existing personnel without having to do a lot of redundant hire. So I did want to share that point before we move on. I appreciate you all indulging me. Thank you.
Well, and Chris, I just want to say, I agree that it can be done. I just want us to be careful that whatever we put in place really does obviously focus on, you know, effective education for our children, but protecting our schools and not creating a, you know, opt-out that hinders schools. So it's not that we can't, it's just, my point is we need to be careful in what we create. So thank you.
Okay, thank you, Mr. Hagerty and Dr. Martin. I think that covers our questions. Dr. Matillo, does that cover it for your section?
It does. I really appreciate the feedback and guidance from the board. And certainly if any other concerns that you think of, don't hesitate to reach out and pass them on so that we can continue to consider them. So thank you.
Well, quick question I had. One, just in terms of, as we look at some of these increased and to some degree new responsibilities, both in teaching and learning and in the cleaning and that sort of thing, are there new types of roles, positions, and in that same regard, are there new skill sets and that sort of thing that have sort of come to light? Most of these, I think, you know, you've identified some things and we've been able to kind of shift employees into those roles and responsibilities and that sort of thing. But are there any sort of new things that you see that are coming about, either again in roles and or responsibilities and positions?
Yeah, I don't think we've really looked at new positions yet. I think our focus has been on how do we train employees on a virtual environment. So I think that's really in conjunction with academics and Office of Professional Learning, and even health services when you talk about, you know, screening and checks of that nature, that we just want to make sure that we're thinking of all those things so that we can appropriately train folks for the responsibilities that they'll fulfill next year. But in terms of new positions, we haven't considered that yet, and we'll certainly look at it as we sort of define what a plan B, a plan C, and plan A for that matter may look like.
Okay. Thank you for that. Thank you for that, sir, and thank you for your presentation and update. Much appreciated.
Thanks, Chair Sutton.
Dr. Gardner, I'll turn it back over to you for our next presentation.
Thank you, Mr. Sutton. And I recognize where we are with time. So what I would like to share with you is that with the board, as we've embarked upon this journey, we really have taken a very comprehensive approach and looking at all the streams of work that impact the opening for the school year. And the facets of work that we unpacked for you last time we were together and today, I hope that you can see how coordinated and how they intersect and interplay with one another. And it is really our intent to make them aligned and to make sure that they provide a strong foundation for the instructional model that we end up offering for our students and for our families and community. We have gathered a tremendous amount of input from a number of stakeholder groups in a variety of formats. And the wealth of input that we have certainly can help shape the decisions and the planning that we go forward. Just as your input has been as we've unpacked the various streams of work. I can't thank you enough for the invaluable input that you've provided, as well as the additional factors that you've identified that need to be part of this planning. We had devoted this next section to just sharing with you how themes appear to be very consistent among the stakeholder groups that we've had opportunity to work with and seeking input. And while we're not going to take as much time we might have originally in unpacking all of it, there are live links that you can certainly access to go much in more detail about any of the community input. But what I am going to ask Beth Hodge to do in this next few slides is to kind of give you an overview of the information that is captured on these slides and share with you the different groups, aside from the groups we've already identified for you, that we have leveraged in seeking input, and just kind of give you a couple of big ideas. Then we'll close by just outlining some next steps that we have tomorrow by sharing with you the two big topics that we want to discuss with you, unpack with you, and get your input. So Ms. Hodge, I'm going to turn it to you right now.
Thank you. Good afternoon, everyone. This first slide here is from the pest analysis that you all did over the last couple of sessions that we've been together. So I went in and attempted to create some major categories for you. And when you have time later, you can click on that link and it gives you a full report of the comments that you made, the comments that you made to each other on your thoughts. And then you'll see that they're color coded. And that color coding is because I was trying to pull together the big thoughts that you were focused on. And you will see that they're not uncommon and not dissimilar from the thoughts of our community and our teachers and principals, and even in your BACs, the comments that and the themes that you were highlighting earlier today and that I heard as folks were talking. One of the things that you did focus on a little bit more than others perhaps is the policy implications, which makes a whole lot of sense for from where you sit. So you have access to that you can take a look at as you're considering what your big picture thoughts. Again, I linked for you the community thought exchange. The themes here are very similar to the themes that you all talked about and that your BACs unpacked even more for us. And when you click on the link for the community thought exchange, you'll get all of the most updated, highest level thoughts, the highest level ratings, as well as the number of community members who have participated in this particular exchange for us. We did leave this exchange open at your request through the end of the week so that after BACs, our parents and community members could feel like they still had a place to provide additional input. The next slide here is based on the themes from our area principal meetings. So our area superintendents hosted a session with all of our principals to gather their input, their questions, their concerns with regards to reopening and online learning. And these are the big categories that came out of their particular conversations. Again, these themes of human resources, staffing, safety, just figuring out how we're doing the logistics of school are all echoed similarly to our community. And then this slide is some feedback that we received from our NCAE representatives. It was shared with us kind of in note form. And so we were able to create these big categories from it. This is just one piece of input that we have from them. We also have another document that we have shared with our core team that they've been using around their vision. We also have engaged them in our academics conversations around scheduling. And just this morning, I received a list of around 50 NCAE members who are very interested in being a part of feedback loops or contributing to our steering committees and the work that they're doing. So we've shared that, and they're going to be in touch with them. Now, we additionally have involved a number of students, and our academics folks are reaching out to our superintendent's student advisory, student leadership council. Sorry, sometimes the acronyms get tied up. Our superintendent's student leadership council, and seeking some input from them. And those would be students who will be seniors this coming year. So we just wanted to share with you at a high level what those themes were, and to make sure that you knew that you had some access to each one of those if you wanted to be able to dive in just a little bit more. It's an unprecedented amount of feedback that we have and inputs that we have. And when we received the teacher data yesterday, it really mirrored some of the big themes that we were hearing from our community as well. So Dr. Gardner, I'll turn it back over to you at this point.
Thank you. And go ahead. And this next slide was a question that we were going to open up if we had time for some dialogue among you. But I will present it to you as a reflection question, knowing that we'll be coming back tomorrow with some additional facets of our work to unpack with you. And that question is, how did the themes from your board advisory councils, as well as the themes from the data we just reviewed, both through the teacher and school-based staff surveys, as well as some of these other stakeholder groups, support or add to your thinking around the key factors that you've identified as a board? So rather than engage in a dialogue, given our time, I just ask you to reflect upon this and allow this to continue to be part of the contributions you make to our discussions moving forward, especially tomorrow. And I'll go over that at this time, the next steps with regard to our work session tomorrow. In our work session tomorrow, Beth, if you'll show that slide, we are going to briefly touch upon the health guidelines and the implications from those guidelines for how we operate and function at the school-based level. We're going to present some big themes around this with regard to social distancing, face coverings, and the like, and how it influences how we interact on the same campus. Just as important is going to be our discussion around options for instructional delivery models. And we will have individuals from our multi-tiered instructional committee with us to work on that and to unpack that work and get input from you. So we are looking forward to our session together tomorrow. With that, Chair Sutton, I will close our presentation for today and let you make any additional comments or entertain any other questions that we may need to answer for you. And thank you again for your support today. Thank you for the invaluable input that you've provided. It is helping us tremendously with regard to the further development of our work. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Gardner. I don't see any hands or questions from, in addition to board members. I would like to sort of ask one sort of final thought or ask one closing question. If all of the staff presenters who have presented this afternoon, if I can ask one question of each of you, and that is, if there is one thing in your particular area of expertise that keeps you up at night with regard to COVID-19 and the reopening, in 30 seconds or less, what would that be? What is the one thing that keeps you up at night in your area of expertise? As we think about reopening in 30 seconds or less, what would that be?
So Chair Sutton, I'll help you facilitate that if you don't mind. I believe everybody was able to stay with us the entire time, but I'm not knowing if they were because I know some other commitments. I'll start with
Lord, if you're there, we lost you.
I'm sorry. I did not unmute myself. I apologize. I was going to help you facilitate because I'm not sure all were able to stay with us through the rest of the session. I think Paul Coe had to leave, but AJ may still be with us, so I'll ask him to share. And Nate Slevick or James may still be with us. If it works for you, Keith.
Sure.
So the first thing that kept me up at night was the worry about keeping employees in paid status. As we move toward next year, while that's important, I think the biggest thing is how do we balance the needs of our students with the health and safety of our employees.
Thank you, sir.
I guess from our perspective, you know, it's really the sheer scale of everything. With the focus on cleaning and safety is now associated with cleaning. You know, we've got a large undertaking, and we've got a lot of square feet to cover on a daily basis. And I think we can work through it, but I think that's a thing we have to be creative to accomplish.
Thank you, sir.
Chair Sutton, I think that may be all we have today.
Okay. All right. Not a problem. Well, thank you for that.
Dr. Gardner, you're online too.
Yes, I am, and I will thank all the work of the hardcore team. I think what everybody is wrestling with as far as the challenge is making sure we're making the best decisions for our students, families, and our staff with regard to the continuity of instruction and keeping them progressing in their academic pursuits. We know that this is a daunting challenge that we're trying to put together in the context of the health guidelines, social distancing, and safety. But our commitment remains ensuring that students receive the most optimal instructional learning opportunities that they can, and we're just trying to make sure that we can do that within the challenges we're faced with regard to the health guidelines and social distance. There are a lot of moving parts, and trying to bring coordination to all of them has been our major focus to drive us to where we need to be instructionally. So thank you.
All right. Seeing no further comments or thoughts from board members, Dr. Gardner, again, thank you for your work in planning this and your facilitation this afternoon. Thank you, everybody, for your time and attention. And we will be back here again tomorrow at 10 o'clock to complete our second work session with regard to our reopening. So again, thank you, everybody, and this meeting stands adjourned.
Thanks, everyone. Thank you, Chair Sutton.
Thank you.